Hello and welcome to the week 5 hangout for the Animal Behaviour and Welfare MOOC on Coursera. And week 5, as you know, was on lions, tigers and bears, oh my, with Heather Bacon as the week leader. In the Hangouts, for those of you who haven't joined us for a Hangout before, or if you just want to be reminded, what happens is we'll start off by answering some questions that we found on the forum that we think are particularly interesting. If you're watching through Google's Hangout app, you will be able to ask questions as you're watching using the Hangout app. And after we've answered some from the forums, we'll start answering the questions from the question app. Remember, if you're watching this on YouTube as well and you like what you see, please do remember to like, share and subscribe and favorite these videos, because if you do that, then YouTube will then suggest our videos to more people, so the message gets out to more and more people. So if you like our animal welfare message, please do remember to do that. So without any further ado, we've got some very interesting questions this week. Loads of ones that made me think, certainly.
Yeah, definitely.
So I don't know, what do we want to start with?
I think we should start with the Indigenous dogs question from Andrew, because I thought that was a really interesting question. And it's, as he said, it's a kind of a difficult topic to include within some of these weeks, because it kind of crosses borders in different areas. So Andrew was asking about the welfare of Indigenous dogs, by which he means dogs like dingoes in Australia and some of the Indigenous Thai dogs, and dogs in the South Pacific. Now, these are dogs that have almost gone through a reverse domestication process. They arrived in Australia and the various islands probably around 5,000 years ago, based on mitochondrial DNA studies, and then sort of evolved away from people. So went through an almost reverse domestication process. So domestication is the process by which animals are changed at the genetic level in order to make them more suitable for living with people. So we select traits that that mean that the genes are changed through selective breeding for the animal to be more suitable for us as a production animal, as a companion animal, etc., etc. And dingoes seem to have gone almost sort of the other way, in that they used to coexist with people when people first landed in Australia, and then they became wild and have become increasingly wild. They now live as independent dogs, so they're not reliant on humans for food, which means that they're not classed as feral dogs. And indeed, they're actually a separate subspecies. So they're listed by the IUCN as vulnerable, because the populations of true dingoes now are really, really small, and they do suffer from hybridization with domestic dogs. So they're a really interesting sort of example of where we draw that line between sort of domestic and wild animals. But because dingoes are not reliant on humans for sustenance or companionship, we would class them as being a wild animal, and genetically they're quite distinct from the domestic dog, Canis familiaris. They do have a hybridized with domestic dogs, and at the human domestic dog interface, you will get sometimes dingoes hanging around. And probably a similar example might be the Scottish wildcat in the UK, in Scotland at least, where Scottish wildcats have become hybridized with domestic cats, and that those kind of hybrids have co-evolved and can live with people and take the role of sort of a feral cat.
Yeah, and of course the hybridization presents a big conservation problem.
Absolutely.
I think, wasn't there a study quite recently looking at the Scottish wildcats in zoos, and a large proportion of them were actually...
A large proportion of wildcats are actually hybrids at the genotypic level, so at the genetic level, where you can classify animals according to their genes, so genotype, or we can classify them according to how they look, which is their phenotype. So you can have an animal that physically looks like a Scottish wildcat, but at the genetic level it may well have some domestic cat DNA mixed in there. And that's one of the big challenges in conservation is, does it matter what its genes are exactly? If it looks like a wildcat, should we just be conserving the phenotype rather than worrying about the genetics? But of course we do need a level of genetic diversity and to maintain a diverse gene pool, otherwise we can get problems with inbreeding.
Yeah, I think black wolves are another one, because the black coat colour is a domesticated dog trait, and so when you see a black wolf, it has somewhere in its history domesticated dog genes in order to introduce the agouti gene for black coats. Don't quote me on that. I think it's the agouti gene.
We do get melanistic variants of lots of different wild animals, though, because, for example, black panthers are actually just a melanistic variant of the leopard. So they're there are differences there. And white tigers also are not a white subspecies, they're an amelanistic variant, so they just don't have that colour gene in them. And we have some problems in zoos, obviously, where zoos might focus on breeding these pretty attractive looking animals that really come from a very small minority gene pool, and by propagating those animals we can inadvertently select for lots of different physical traits which are problematic in terms of the animal's health, a little bit like the pedigree dog issues that domestic companion animals face.
Yes, definitely. But I thought it was a really interesting question. It certainly made me think, that one. But I think it was quite interesting as well that sorry, I forgot who it was that asked it. Was it John?
The question.
Whoever you were, Andrew. So sorry. But I think it was quite interesting. You noticed that it didn't fit neatly into one of our weeks, into the companion animals of the wild week. And in biology, we are very keen on trying to categorize everything, whereas much of life is actually a bit more of a sliding scale. So I think you were quite. It was quite good of you to pick up on that. That yes, it is an issue which spans multiple parts of conservation and of welfare. So it was a very interesting question.
And on the hybridization sort of topic, I guess one of the questions we got from Celia was, how is the welfare of captive hybrids addressed in general? And that's quite an interesting question, because in general we try and avoid hybridization within a captive wildlife context, because maintaining that genetic diversity within a population is really important, but we don't want to dilute the gene pool or mix the gene pool up by creating hybrids, which then may create phenotypic differences in that population. So we get wildcats that don't really look like wildcats because actually they're mostly domestic cats, and we start to lose the what the animal should really look like. So we, as much as possible, any responsible zoo or captive wildlife facility will discourage hybridization. It does occur very occasionally. It's usually because of just a mistake in how animals are managed. But some more irresponsible zoos may breed hybrids just for a public reaction because they're unique and interesting. And for me, that's probably a welfare problem, because we don't know what the needs of those hybrid animals are. We don't know if temperamentally they might be more similar to one species or the other. And an example of that is the liger, which is a cross between a lion and a tiger. Obviously animals that live on different continents and wouldn't ever normally breed in the wild. They can breed in captivity, and their offspring tend to be sterile. And that, again, can be a welfare problem, because those animals then can never live a normal social life, never fulfill their normal reproductive urges, never have normal social interactions. So I think most responsible zoos or captive wildlife collections will discourage the breeding of hybrids, and that's certainly something that I would side with as well.
Yes, me too. I think as well, one of the more common hybrids which do occur are particularly in when people are keeping ungulates and also equine species. There tends to be a little bit more hybridization there, because as well we tend to keep those animals in groups much more than we would keep, for example, lions and tigers in a shared enclosure. So uncontrolled breeding risk is more the risk is greater of uncontrolled breeding in those shared groups, even though they're quite good from welfare perspective of the behaviours of those animals within those groups. So it's a complex issue, but yes, we wouldn't really say that any hybrid is due to responsible breeding in any way, shape or form.
No. If anyone has any questions and you're watching live, please do feel free to submit them via the app, and we can answer those as we go along. But otherwise, we'll just go with the questions that have been submitted through the discussion boards.
Yeah, we'll just go with the ones that we like. So do remember to put your own in. So
a very quick one. We had a question about a brown bear cub that has been abandoned by its mother when it was 2 months old and is now being hand raised. As you'll know from presentations and information that was given earlier in the course, particularly from the work that Professor Cathy Dwyer has done with sheep, we know that maternal relationships are very, very important for maternal development in all species, really, in humans and in other animals. And that work has been done in humans as well, looking at children from deprived backgrounds that perhaps don't have the maternal contact that they ought to have. And we know that can have a huge psychological impact on an animal for the rest of its life, and can predispose the animal to developing abnormal behaviours. And certainly in my experience, and I've done quite a lot of work with bears in lots of different circumstances, but bears that are traumatically separated from their mother at a young age do tend to often display this paw sucking, we call it motorbiking sometimes, because they tend to go and make a noise that's almost a little bit like a motorbike engine. And we suspect that that's probably a comfort behaviour. It's probably a self-soothing behaviour that they've developed because they've been weaned much earlier from their mother than they would naturally. They don't have anything to suckle onto, and that suckling behaviour can be very comforting for young animals. So the likelihood is that that behaviour may well persist to adulthood, so long as it's not self-injurious, so long as there isn't any hair loss or any inflammation of the paw, then I wouldn't worry about it too much, but I would just try and offer that animal as many different behavioural opportunities through enrichment and positive operant conditioning as possible to try and distract it onto other positive behaviours. Okay.
So I thought this was quite an interesting question as well. So again, on the idea of keeping the husbandry of the captive wild animals. So this was from John, I think, and he was asking, is it fair from a welfare or behavioural point of view to house predators and prey in close proximity where each can presumably perceive the other either through scent, sight or sound?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. I think when we're managing wild animals in captivity, it's something that is often done. Zoos will often house predators and prey species. We have to remember that in the wild, predators and prey would usually share the same ecosystem. It's obviously how they coexist and survive. It will depend on the prey species' individual flight distance, and it will depend on the scent, their ability to smell or to hear predators, and whether the prey is stressful for the predators will also depend on the predator's ability to smell, see or hear them, and also will depend on the predator's satiety and its behavioural drive to want to go and hunt at a particular time. So I've seen predators that are housed right next to prey, and neither of them seem to demonstrate any particular signs of stress in terms of their behaviour. Although when it comes to feeding time, you do see a lot more focused and directed behaviour, particularly from wolves. If they can see any visual stimulation in terms of ungulates in nearby enclosures, you'll get a lot more sort of pacing behaviour, that's patrolling behaviour relating to them seeing the ungulates and then visually just looking and staring at the ungulates a lot. And then that tends to dissipate once they've been fed and the satiety's been reached. Whether it can be a welfare problem or not, I think depends on the individual animals and how they react. And I think you have to monitor their behaviour to make sure it's not being stressful for them. And potentially you could look at other measures as well, such as fecal cortisol, to evaluate that as well. But the only way to know really would be to assess individual animals and see how they're responding. It's very difficult to give a general sort of catch-all recommendation for that situation.
So just as a reminder, if you're trying to figure out how to submit a question through the question and answers app, if you are watching through the Google Hangout, if you move your mouse towards the left side of the screen, I don't know if it's that way or that way from your point of view, you'll see a little Q&A sort of symbol. If you click on that, then you'll be able to ask some questions live. So we are waiting to hear from you.
Yeah, please do. Okay. So I think this question was quite interesting. This was from Elise, and this is with regards to the rhino hunting permit that was auctioned off in South Africa. I think it was 2 years ago now, maybe 18 months, it's around that time anyway. But basically what happened was a Texas hunting club, Texas in the southern United States hunting club, auctioned off a permit, a CITES approved permit, for a hunter to be able to travel to South Africa and to shoot a male rhino that was considered to be older and had already had repeated matings, and his genes were represented in the current population. And this generated quite a lot of media interest, and it's an interesting ethical conundrum, I think, in many ways. Obviously, people will have very strong opinions on whether they agree or disagree with hunting in general, with trophy hunting, with hunting of species that are endangered. This was interesting because it was sanctioned by the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they're sort of the global governing body for conservation of endangered species. And because it was sanctioned by them, it raised some interesting questions in terms of South Africa, particularly the last couple of years, has come under intense pressure from illegal rhino poaching. and the market for rhino horn is incredibly valuable. So if you can access rhino horn, then it's worth weight for weight much more than gold in terms of its market value. And so that drives a massive illegal poaching trade. And there were questions raised, obviously, in terms of the ethics of, well, is it acceptable for a US hunter that's paid, this large amount of money, that's won this auction, to go over there and hunt a rhino? What kind of message does that send to the people who are working in anti-poaching, or what kind of message does that send about the life of an endangered species? If rhinos are endangered, should we be protecting all rhinos, even the ones that are already represented in their population? Or is it okay to shoot a rhino, to hunt a rhino publicly in this way, if that money that's raised will then fund more conservation initiatives? And I think that's a really challenging question to answer in terms of the message it sends about animal protection in the wild, and the message it sends about the individual value of life for that individual animal, and also how effectively that money is used in terms of conservation projects as well. From a welfare perspective, I guess it's a wild animal, and so it spent its life living as naturally as possible up until the point of death. And you would hope that if the hunter is a good shot, that the kill is quick and clean, although that can be challenging with large animals like rhinos, and you do need to be very experienced and hunter with specialist equipment that obviously is suitable for that type of animal. And as distasteful as many people might find hunting, if the kill is quick and clean and humane, then I guess from a welfare point of view, then that's as much as we would expect, is that an animal has a good life and a humane death. But I can certainly understand that it can be quite an uncomfortable and difficult ethical situation to kind of figure out how you feel about that situation.
Very much so. And I think as well, the component of it being auctioned off to the highest bidder, I think also doesn't sit very well with some people. And that also possibly relates in some ways to the skill of the hunter. It's not necessarily the most skilled hunter which is going to be able to do this, but rather the one that was able to pay, or the consortium that was able to pay, because quite often these are bought as group. In fact, was this one bought by a group? I can't actually remember.
I think it was an individual, but
was it an individual? So that's something as well to sort of factor into everything that contributes to how you think about that situation. So John Hodgkinson has asked an interesting question, and it's relating back to the Production Animals Week that we had last week. And so we mentioned the importance of young animals remaining with the mother to prevent problems in later life. Yet in cattle, it was suggested that early removal was preferable. How can this be the case? Yes, it seems a bit sort of contradictory and hypocritical, doesn't it? This is the early removal of the calf from the cow in a dairy scenario. So this is an intensive dairy production. The early removal of calf from cow is partly done because the calf is an economic drain on milk from the cow. We want that milk for ourselves, for our dairy system. So that's one reason why we do it. We don't do it from a welfare perspective for that. We do it for the economical reason. The calf and the cow being separated early, if you're going to separate them early, taking them away earlier still stops the bonding from happening. So it's less distressing for the mother. Yes, less distressing from the mother, not necessarily for the calf. So because no strong bond has formed, we see less behavioural indicators of stress from cows which haven't bonded with their calves when the calf is separated. And it's important to recognise these are domesticated animals. We don't the husbandry we do for domesticated animals is not necessarily the same kind of husbandry that we would do for captive animals, and you'd probably be able to.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing to remember is that what we're talking about in terms of early maternal separation being traumatic, we're talking about it being traumatic for how it influences brain development in the neonatal animal. If you're a dairy calf, probably in terms of economic terms, it doesn't really matter about your brain development being impacted that much. You're probably not going to live long enough to develop a whole range of abnormal behaviours.
Certainly if you're a male.
Although we do see some abnormal behaviours like navel sucking and tail sucking in dairy calves that are early weaned. So those abnormal behaviours definitely do exist. But I think the point that Fritha was probably making in the Farm Animal Week is that it's less stressful for the mother, and therefore it doesn't impact productivity or milk production as much. And so from an economic point of view, it's preferable. From a purely welfare and behaviour point of view, from the calf's perspective, it is of course better to be with his mum than on his own.
Yeah, and there are more organic farms and smaller farm units which will do that and keep the calf and cow together for longer. So, but yes, it does seem a bit of a hypocritical kind of a point, doesn't it?
Okay, I'm going to move on to a thread that's been sort of running on the discussion board, and it sort of touches on a question that's just been posted as well by Andrea. So this is with regards to the euthanasia of Marius the giraffe in Copenhagen last year, I think it was, and lots of emotional reactions and lots of opinions on that one particular case. I think the first thing to recognise is that whilst that was one case that was reported heavily in the media, and so everybody is aware of it, this practice is commonplace in zoos around the world. There are very few zoos that do not breed and cull some species to some extent, and there are lots and lots of reasons for that. First of all, when we're talking about euthanasia of these animals, we need to be clear on what we're talking about. And there's been, again, some discussion on the boards that perhaps Marius wasn't euthanized because he wasn't suffering, or the methods used were a rifle. Actually, euthanasia translates from the Greek as good death. And all that means is that his death was pain-free and fear-free and was as humane as we could make it. And that's the same really for any animal, whether it's a companion animal, whether it's a production animal that's going into humane slaughter. We use slightly different terminology, but essentially euthanasia just means a humane death. And if that's what he had, then it was euthanasia. In terms of how those decisions are made, it comes back to the role of the zoo in terms of conservation breeding. We tend to manage zoo animal populations as what we call meta populations. So there are multiple zoos within a region, such as Europe or North America, and those zoos work together to form a coordinated stud book of breeding for endangered species. One zoo on its own is not going to achieve good conservation breeding because the number of animals it can hold of a particular species will be too small, and you would very quickly get inbreeding. So we have a stud book coordinator that coordinates breeding programs and movements of animals between different zoos in order to make sure that the best animals are matched together to promote genetic diversity within the species. If individuals are born, and depending on the species, if they're social animals, quite often what we call surplus, because perhaps they're overrepresented in the genetic population. If they're females, sometimes those animals can actually just be absorbed within the natal group. However, for most social animals, male animals tend to disperse once they reach the age of puberty. And if we maintain them within the group, then we get lots of conflict in terms of them wanting to breed, and that not being appropriate in terms of the genetic situation, but also in terms of conflict with their father, which is the breeding male of that group. So those young male animals have to be removed. So it's easier to accommodate surplus females than it is to accommodate surplus males. I think also it's important to recognise that while it's very easy to criticise decisions, a lot of the animals we're talking about have very specific needs and requirements for management in captivity. And there aren't really very many easy options for managing them. People often quite glibly talk about contraception or transport, or rehoming, and these are actually really, really challenging options, both logistically and from a welfare perspective, when we look at some of these species. Transport of giraffe is associated with high levels of morbidity and mortality. Different contraceptives in different species, again, can be very challenging. So, for example, in carnivore species such as lions or tigers, for many, many years, we used a contraceptive called megestrol acetate. Now, it was only after that contraceptive had been used in large carnivores for about 10 to 15 years that there was enough evidence to review its use and actually find it could cause significant health and welfare problems in terms of causing uterine cancers and different levels of uterine disease within the reproductive tract. And that meant that contraceptive has now been pretty much phased out of use because it's just not ethical to use that when we know that it causes disease in a population. So there are contraceptives available, but they're not always suitable for all species in all circumstances, and they can cause physical problems, and they can sometimes cause psychological problems as well. So making those decisions really has to be done on a case-by-case basis, and it can be very challenging. We also have, I guess, the role of a zoo in terms of what a member association like EASA would support. And the role of the zoo is conservation breeding and maintaining that genetic diversity. We know in many populations that maintaining reproductive health means that the animal needs to maintain cycling. And we've seen problems in some animals that are held in zoos, such as elephants, where they reach what we call reproductive senescence, or they stop cycling because they haven't had enough pregnancies, and they basically cycle through all their reproductive cycles really early, and then they stop being reproductive at a much earlier age than they would naturally. If they have pregnancies, as they're designed to do in the wild, then they don't reach reproductive senescence so early, and they can carry on and maintain reproduction, which is important if we're serious about maintaining genetic diversity within a captive population. So there's lots and lots of issues in terms of how we manage captive wildlife that can be very, very complicated. And the stud book holder who manages that species has to consider all of these different options. Additionally, if zoos are serious about conservation, that's really where they need to focus their funding. So their role isn't really to act as sanctuaries or to take in any animals that are stray or that don't have a home. And I know a lot of people were upset about the idea that Marius wasn't rehomed, but there are lots and lots of giraffes that are produced, and other species, actually, lots of other animals, deer, rodents that are produced as well, of many different species, and not all homes can be found for those animals. So what do we do with them? You could argue that zoos shouldn't be breeding them in the first place, but if we don't breed, then there's a problem in terms of maintaining captive populations and reproductive health. Breeding can also be very, very important for social enrichment in some species and maintaining a cohesive and stable group. So we have to consider the quality of life of the group as a whole as well. So all of these are challenges, and I'm not saying that there's an ideal solution in terms of one approach is better than the others. It's just that zoos are weighing up these challenges and making these decisions all the time. And it really isn't a very simple process at all. It can be very complicated.
I think also it's important to recognise that zoos exist because people go to see these animals, and zoos have to stock. From an economic perspective, they have to stock their exhibits with animals which people are going to come and see. So they can use these big charismatic animals as draws, and then do some very important behind the scenes breeding with animals which are perhaps less charismatic. And I think, has Edinburgh done snails?
Yeah, so the partula snail, which was extinct in the wild, and that has been successfully bred in captivity both by Edinburgh Zoo and the Zoological Society of London as well. So there's lots of work done behind the scenes. Not many people really care about the conservation of snails. It's pretty challenging to raise money for those kind of conservation issues. But by generating money from people coming to see large charismatic animals, zoos can then use that funding for those conservation priority species which people are less interested in, or perhaps aren't even aware that they exist.
Yeah.
Other issues, that sort of ethical issues that come up in terms of that, is the transfer of animals like giraffes to other places, and that is certainly a possibility, but there is obviously a reasonable concern as to where those animals go. We know, for example, that historically sometimes zoos have transferred animals to other countries, and that the standards in those countries in terms of animal husbandry and veterinary care can perhaps not be what they should be for that animal's welfare, and that in itself is of course a huge welfare problem. We also have to appreciate that Nat just popping in to disturb us, need to grab coffee. So there's lots and lots of challenges, and the other thing to think about is, when we're talking about welfare, we're talking about sentience across a whole range of different vertebrate species, and if we recognise that all animals are sentient, all animals are capable of suffering, of feeling fear, distress and pain, then why do we prioritise the well-being of one individual over another? Why is it okay to kill a cow to feed lions, but it's not okay to kill a giraffe to feed lions? And that actually brings me back to a question that was on the discussion board, which was asking whether there's any studies that have been done that show that feeding more natural prey is of any kind of nutritional value. As far as I'm aware, there are no studies that have been done specifically on that, but we do know, for example, that grass-fed ungulates have much higher levels of omega-3 in their meat, and they tend to be more nutritionally valuable than, for example, grain-fed ungulates. And we know that from beef cattle, for example. So grass-fed beef is nutritionally much better for you than grain-fed beef, just because the animals are on a diet which is richer in antioxidants and omega-3s, and that is then stored within the meat. So yes, there can be some benefits depending on the diet that the food animal has had. So that's quite an interesting thing to consider as well. I think one of the big challenges in zoos is that in many ways, when you're managing a captive population like that, you have to almost consider them to be production animals. You're raising them for a purpose, and that purpose is conservation, just like you're raising cows for meat consumption potentially. And yet when we visit a zoo, we give the animals names and we can sponsor them and we can adopt them. And in the minds of the general public, zoo animals are very much almost like pets. And emotionally, it seems very, very difficult to consider euthanizing a healthy pet. That's quite an ethical challenge, I think, for a lot of us. From a zoo's perspective, what they're doing is raising animals for conservation breeding, and if those animals aren't suitable for that target, then they're kind of surplus to requirements. And so you get that much more sort of utilitarian economic arguments coming into play as to whether it's worthwhile putting resources that could be used for conservation towards maintaining those individuals which don't have a genetic value. All of these arguments are very, very difficult, I think, to try and have a black and white viewpoint on. And I think it's perfectly valid to feel emotionally uncomfortable with some of these situations, but we have to recognise that from a welfare point of view, what we're considering is whether the animal has a good life and a humane death. And if those criteria are fulfilled, then it's not a welfare problem.
Yeah, and zoos also, you'll be able to tell me exactly the name of the organisation because I can't remember it, but zoos are also not fully in charge of which animals they have at any one time. If they're looking after a species which is part of a certain conservation program, they can that conservation program can say we need these animals in another zoo because this zoo is better at breeding.
Yeah, so the stud book. So in Europe it would be the European stud book, and in North America it would be this species survival program. And they're coordinated by committees of experts who decide which animals breed and which animals are moved where, and any transfers or any breeding should be approved by those. By the
so it's not necessarily always the individuals at the zoos who are making these choices as well. It's a much more broad and coordinated program than you might necessarily recognise, at least for the very responsible zoos which are part of these programs.
And we have to remember that not all zoos are part of these programs, and that's another layer of complexity in that we have some zoos who perhaps aren't contributing to conservation breeding in that way, and perhaps are more towards the just animal exhibit side of things. And again, that's a whole different set of ethical challenges to deal with.
Yeah.
One of the questions we had was whether we think there are any certain species which should or should not be kept in captivity from an ethical point of view. I think that's really difficult to answer, simply because for a lot of zoo animals, we have a real lack of evidence as to what those animals need. We can assess their behaviour, we can use frameworks like the 5 freedoms to see if we're meeting their needs. We can do studies looking at stress hormones and see if they're exhibiting normal or abnormal behaviour, and then try and evaluate the welfare of those individual animals. And certainly I do think that there are some species that are more challenging to be managed in captivity. We certainly have some species that have very, very specific needs. So some of the amphibians, for example, very specific needs in terms of temperature, humidity, ultraviolet lighting regimes, access to food, those kinds of things. But if all of those things are brought together, which they can be with relatively small space, and if that's understood properly, those animals can be housed very successfully, even though their ability to cope outside of that environment is very limited. And often, if those animals are not coping, you'll get deaths quite quickly. At the other end of the scale, we have animals that are often quite charismatic and controversial, and these are things like dolphins, whales, the cetaceans, elephants perhaps, and polar bears, which are often raised as iconic species that perhaps don't do very well in captivity. And again, we have to look at things like the prevalence of abnormal behaviour, which we know in those types of species, a lot of them do exhibit abnormal behaviour. We have to look at their capacity for normal social interactions. And traditionally, we've perhaps not managed elephants in captivity in a way that is that aligns with how they would normally interact socially. In the wild, they would live in matrilineal herds of related females. in captivity, what we've traditionally tended to do is group unrelated females together and call that a herd, and it's absolutely not the same thing at all. And of course, with cetaceans, we have challenges because of their enormous size and their great capacity for covering huge distances and living in a very complex social environment and ecosystem. Then we have a huge challenge in terms of attempting even to replicate that in captivity. We also have to look at where these animals have come from, and animals that come from the wild or that may be separated from their natural social group will also experience a level of trauma associated with that. And as we mentioned earlier, that can have behavioural implications for the rest of the animal's life. And so we don't just need to look at the animal's current environment, we also need to look at the environment that it came from, and whether its evolutionary needs and genetic expectations are being managed and met in captivity. And I think sometimes that's perhaps something we don't do very well.
I would definitely agree. Quite often a justification for keeping these very charismatic animals in captivity is that they provide a greater educational bonus because people are very intrigued by them and people will come to see them and therefore take in some learning because of that. And the educational value of zoos is something which is very much talked about, and I think something which really should be evaluated in light of the kind of technologies that we have now. You know, we can really look at animals from all across the world from the comfort of our, of our own homes, and using tools such as the internet. So the educational values of zoos is, I think, a very, very important part of what zoos do. And again, it's something that a responsible zoo will take on in a very responsible manner by only using it, only promoting the animals which they can care for, and only taking on the animals that they can care for, and using those animals as the hook to get people in to then teach them further.
Definitely. And I also think that in the way that just as we apply sort of scientific rigor to things like the assessment of animal welfare by looking at their animals' behavioural and physiological responses and outputs, I also think we need to apply that same rigor to assessment of conservation and education. Very often I hear X billion pounds was spent on conservation, or we got 20,000 visitors a month, or whatever. And that's great, but they're all input values. And when we're looking at evaluating the robustness of an institution like a zoo, what we want to know is, well, what did people learn when they visited, and how did it impact on their attitudes, and how did it change their behaviour? Does that mean that they're now going to go out and be the conservationists of the future? Yeah. And they're very, very difficult questions to evaluate from a research perspective, but just having, an X number of people visited really isn't a very robust measure of how effective an education programme is. And spending X number of pounds on conservation isn't a very effective measure of how effective a conservation programme is. So we need to, I think, be more critical and more robust in how we measure the outputs of those programmes. What do they really mean, and what are their impacts? Which is in fact what you do. Or try to.
Yes. You do. We do have some, I think this is a complex question. Do we want to have a shot at this one?
Kind of. What is conservation? Saving 50 animals, 100 animals, breeding or researching animals, or reintroducing them back into the natural environment? I think that's a really good question. That's from Andrea again. Yeah, well done, Andrea. It's a really good question. I think it, again, not very well defined, and it probably depends a little bit on your own personal viewpoint. There are many aspects to conservation, and there's a European Convention on the promotion of biodiversity and conservation. Essentially, conservation is the protection and promotion of biodiversity. So that includes plants and other flora and fauna, as well as what we might class as our sort of traditional zoo animals. It's everything, including invertebrates and corals and a whole range of things. And that's what we need to think about when we think about conservation. I think we need to think about protecting ecosystems. Conservation can be as simple or as complex, I guess, as things like promoting recycling or reducing power consumption, because those things have a knock-on effect on the environment, on things like climate change, which can then impact ecosystems. And it could be conservation breeding, which is obviously the management of animals in captivity. It may be reintroduction. That's quite a small part of what zoos do, simply because reintroduction to the wild is incredibly difficult logistically and very expensive. But there are some quite well-known introduction to the wild programs.
I think they become well known and then possibly become a little bit overinflated in the overall story, because a lovely success story and people like to hear about it.
But I think it's reasonable to ask that question and say, well, what is conservation? What are these animals being housed for? What about public engagement? Is it just a case of we keep these animals because they're charismatic and people will come and see them, and then we use that money for other initiatives? It's very difficult, really, I think, to sort of encapsulate exactly what conservation is within a few sentences, because it's all of those activities, and it really depends on the value that you place as an individual on those activities and whether you think they're justified or not.
Yeah. One world, one health. It's all interconnected. Sorry, we're just reading these questions.
Interested in the question, does it matter to a deer why it was killed? Hunters say that deer and elk know when it's hunting season and where they're safe. How can we learn more about what wild prey animals know? That's a really interesting question. It's from Jasmine.
Yeah.
I think that there's probably an element of truth in that. I suspect that animals learn, and because evolutionarily there's a huge incentive to learning about different times of year, and certainly older animals in the group, in a herd animal, that have lived through hunting seasons will, I would expect, learn over time that at certain times of the year there are areas where they're more likely to be predated, i.e. areas where licensed hunting is allowed, and areas where they are unlikely to be predated, i.e. private land where hunters don't have access. And that really would just be a learning experience of older animals that have been through that process and have escaped from hunters, or have had experiences of other members of the herd being hunted, and learned from that experience and learned to avoid certain areas of land at certain times of the year. Or that certainly would be my interpretation of that. But I agree, it would be very interesting to understand more about that process and how exactly animals are able to learn and to spatially map safe and dangerous areas with time. I think that's a really interesting question.
I'm not aware of any studies, but I haven't looked, so there might well be some research out there, but none that
I imagine it would
mind.
be similar to sort of migratory animals and how they map spatially where they need to be at different times of the year for breeding resources or for feeding resources, and deer and elk will do that as well. They'll move around into different areas of their home range depending on the food resources that are available, and that will be partly a learned behaviour that's passed down through the generations. I expect avoidance of hunters is probably something similar.
Yeah. Can zoos not also? So John is returning to the question he'd asked previously and saying, we talked about maternal separation and the economic argument with production animals, but can zoos also not use the economics argument in relation to husbandry and accommodation? Well, as we've been mentioning, yes, zoos do use an economic argument. However, part of the economic argument for zoos is that when they're bringing in visitors, which is where they make the majority of their money, they are bringing those visitors in because the visitors want to see the animals in a natural environment, particularly in Western countries where we prize the natural environment very highly. So zoos promote this natural living, and they promote their enclosures which allow the animals to remain in more natural groups and the like. So it's a different driver. There's
been a bit of research that shows that people respond much more positively to green enclosure environments. I'm always a little bit cynical about everything, and my question would be, okay, that's pleasing for the visitor, but what does that environment actually generate for the animal? And I think I mentioned that in one of the videos this week, looking at a very green bear enclosure, and you could see trees behind that enclosure, but those trees were actually not accessible because the enclosure barrier was between the bear and those trees. And although he was in a very green enclosure, it was actually quite flat and quite barren, and so from a behavioural opportunities perspective, there wasn't very much for him to do, even though it looked nice from a visitor perspective. So from a welfare point of view, I think we have to be concerned about what opportunities an enclosure offers for an animal. Obviously, from a visitor perspective and a generating sort of money and an economic perspective, the zoo will have to balance that with also what works for the visitors. And again, that's one of the compromises of captivity, and that boils down to whether as a visitor you're interacting and partaking of that industry. Yeah. I guess it's important to remember that zoos are, when they are
providing this for their visitors, they are selling that experience.
Yeah,
they are
absolutely.
selling when they're getting visitors in there. They want to conserve, they are interested in animal welfare, the good ones, certainly.
Yeah.
But that's how they make their money, by selling tickets. So it's important.
Some zoos will have practices as well where each time they build a new enclosure, a proportion of the budget that they would spend on that enclosure will go to in situ conservation projects overseas. So often there is also a connection between development of enclosures within the zoo and then production of finances and generating money for in situ conservation programs as well. So sometimes they do try and link those things as much as possible. Okay, just have a look at some of the other questions that we got.
To see if we had any new ones since we've been on.
Okay, so we had a question from Elise, which was asking what our thoughts were on catching or taking something from the wild for educational purposes to be put into a zoo or aquarium, for example, only to be released many months later. And she mentions an example from the Seattle Aquarium where they house giant octopi caught from the wild, used for educational purposes, and then released a year later. I thought this was a really interesting point because I'm from the UK, obviously. It's not a practice that we're particularly familiar with, because in the UK, taking something from the wild for display to the public, if it was releasable, would be against the Wildlife and Countryside Act. You can only keep wild animals in captivity, animals that have been caught from the wild in captivity, if you have a license from the government. So I'm not sure exactly what the legal situation is in the US, but certainly in the UK, it's quite a controversial sort of practice. I think from a welfare point of view, it would obviously be quite stressful. Any change is stressful, even positive change. Even enrichment can sometimes be stressful for animals. So I think the change associated with transport and husbandry is bound to be stressful. And then even when the animal is reintroduced into the wild, we know that reintroductions are stressful for animals as well. They're a learning process. Yeah. The animal still has to adapt. So that process of going through change between different husbandry environments, from wild to captivity back to the wild, will absolutely be stressful. From an ethical viewpoint, I guess I'd want to know why the animal was taken into captivity in the first place. What's the justification for that? Is it for medical treatment? In which case you could argue that that's a justified benefit to the animal in terms of the cost of bringing it into captivity. But if it's capture simply for the purpose of exhibition, then I think personally I would probably feel a little bit uncomfortable with that.
And I think again we come back to this idea of we should evaluate what it is that we do in an evidence-based manner, collect evidence, and then reevaluate, is this still a practice we want to continue doing? Evidence-based arguments are the way to go. Definitely.
Okay. Oh, have you ever seen the movie Grizzly Man? And if you have, how do you feel from a welfare perspective about Timothy Treadwell's interactions with the bears?
I haven't actually.
I have not seen the film, but I am aware of it. My understanding is that Timothy went and lived with grizzly bears in Northern America for a period of time. And if I remember rightly, eventually was killed by those bears. Yes. I think it's an interesting, I think we have examples of this in many different situations. There are people that go and live with wolves, people that have gone and lived with bears. And I think wanting to have that connection with nature is something that's actually quite a primitive desire in a lot of people. I think wanting to be outside, wanting to interact, and I think wanting to have that connection with animals is also something that's very fundamental. It's why people go to zoos. It's why we keep animals in captivities, because in many ways that's a lot more convenient than going and living in the wild with grizzly bears, and often safer. But there is a drive for us to connect with animals in that emotional and sometimes in a physical way as well.
And I think also, I'm sure you'll probably have had some experiences yourself where you have been endangered by animals in your care. It's happened to me with cattle a couple of times. When you do work closely with animals, you do encounter situations where the animals are reacting in such a way that does put you in danger. It's definitely something to be aware of. I say that you can never trust an animal 100%. And
even domestic animals.
Yeah, I would never trust one of my animals 100%. In fact, I don't know if you can see, but my hands are covered in scratches at the moment from my kitten. But that's it's something that you accept, I think, when you do work with animals, and you try to minimize the risk as much as possible.
I think when you are putting yourself in a situation where you are encroaching into an animal's home range and into an animal's environment, then you are accepting a certain level of risk. And I unfortunately think, and this is just a personal opinion, I think that in terms of maybe the ethics of that, is that perhaps it's not as respectful as we would like to think. I think often you're putting your own desire to interact with those animals above the needs of the animals, just to get on and enjoy being a bear. And I think a bear in the wild wants to do bear things. A bear in the wild doesn't necessarily want to have a human friend, and that's not something they've evolved to cope with. And I think forcing bears or any other wild animal into a situation where perhaps you think it's a positive relationship, but the animal may not see it like that, I think you're always going to run that risk of having a level of conflict, and that obviously as a human is going to be very dangerous. Obviously that situation was extremely sad, and it's difficult to know exactly what happened in that scenario, but I think anytime you do go into the wild and choose to interact with a large dangerous carnivore, you are going to be putting yourself up to a degree of risk.
There is a degree of risk, absolutely.
I don't think these animals they're not domesticated, and I wouldn't even trust a domesticated animal 100%.
No.
So
yeah, it is a very sad case.
It is. Okay, just having a look. Have we had anything else on the board?
Something that we've kind of already addressed. The stereotypy one.
Sorry, we're just having a quick look at the laptop.
Here, yeah.
Okay, so we've got a question. It's quite an interesting question. It's about stereotypies in captive animals. So this is from Andrea again. Recently told that some of these abnormal behaviours that you might see, such as pacing, are actually necessary. For example, the keeper may rely on the animal to be pacing up and down its fence before feeding time, so they can quickly and easily get it into another enclosure when they open a gate. So the animal is pacing before food time. This is actually just a normal predictive behaviour rather than stereotypy. The animal knows food is coming, so it paces in anticipation. The pacing is then accidentally reinforced when the food arrives. According to this opinion, pacing behaviour is thus only worrying when it occurs all day long, regardless of whether food or enrichment is coming. Okay, so one definition that I really like is the definition that animals experiencing enhanced welfare are free from behaviours that are indicative of fear or frustration, and they display a diversity of behaviour similar to that typically observed in the wild. Now, we know that pacing behaviours generally don't occur in wild animals, but it's important to be very clear on what we're talking about when we're talking about stereotypy. Not all pacing is stereotypy. So there are some species of animals, such as tigers and wolves, which will patrol their enclosures. It's not a repetitive behaviour, and the way that they make that movement is not the same as a stereotypical pacing movement, but it can be difficult to tell the difference between the two. We also get animals which display repetitive behaviours, as has been mentioned, around the time of feeding. Now, for me, that would be an indication that the animal is frustrated. There's a level of anticipation and excitement there which isn't being satiated. The animal knows that a predictable, exciting event such as feeding is happening, and that does result in a level of frustration because they can't get to their food right now and they know it's coming. Whether that's a welfare problem or not in that very, very acute time would be a different question. There are some behaviours and some feelings or emotional states of frustration or that when behavioural drives aren't satiated, where perhaps for a very short period of time are just unacceptable stress for that animal. But if they become chronic, or if they happen repeatedly whilst the animal is managed, then they are a welfare problem, because the animal doesn't have any choice, it doesn't have any control over that situation. It can't go out and hunt its own food to satiate its own drive for hunger, or it can't go out and predate on something. And we have evolutionary behavioural drives as well. So primates engage in social grooming, and if they're kept in isolation, there will be a level of behavioural frustration associated with that, and that might result in self-grooming or self-mutilation to some level. So different species have different behavioural drives. If they're frustrated for short periods of time, the animal may be able to cope, but it's coping. It's not necessarily in a good welfare state. If those drives are frustrated for longer periods of time or become chronic, that's when we get the development of abnormal repetitive behaviours, and they're indicative of fear, frustration, and the frustration of those evolutionary drives. So it's quite a complex area to be able to evaluate and understand, and we do have to be careful not to confuse pacing stereotypies, particularly with normal patrolling behaviours, but that's something that really you need to be quite experienced to be able to distinguish.
It is difficult. Not necessarily sure I'd get it right all the time, to be honest with you. This is a quite interesting one, which I'd quite like to have a stab at, from Anna in the thread, who's referring back to a topic which we talked about on the forums towards the start of the class, which was, what would the welfare implications be of a de-extinction? And Anna means in this case, for example, if we were to able to bring back woolly mammoths. So I'm thinking along the lines of a Jurassic Park situation here. So assuming it would be kept in a zoo and have no others of its kind to interact with, what would the welfare problems of this animal be worth? And what would we learn about it? So would it be worth doing it? So from a welfare perspective, from an ethical perspective, and a totally hypothetical discussion here, because I don't think we're close to bringing back velociraptors or anything anytime soon, outside of the cinemas. But I think this is a very interesting ethical question, because it does sort of say, is it worthwhile doing this for the educational value, the research value? There is an entertainment value to it as well, and zoos do the entertainment value. And is that going to be worth just bringing back one of these animals? So I'd suggest that certainly for woolly mammoths, we know they moved in herds. We have archaeological evidence of that. So we would never want to keep one in captivity. We'd want a group. We'd probably want a related group, because we know that elephants are related to woolly mammoths and they like to live in related groups. So there's some evidence there. We'd have to look at what evidence do we have about the way woolly mammoths behaved, and how could we possibly provide for that if we were going to do it in any kind of responsible manner at all. And even then, you still have to come back to the question, I think it was is it Dr. Malcolm in Jurassic Park that says, you're so eager to see if you could that you don't stop to think if you should. That's it.
Jurassic Park and Terry Pratchett this week.
Yes.
Getting very diverse in our quotes. Rest in peace to Terry.
I know, I'm so sad about that.
Okay, we've just had another question on the Google Hangout, and this is from John. There's a general agreement that short-term stress can be a positive experience. Is there an identifiable time element that differentiates between short and long-term stress? The short answer to that is no. But I will expand, obviously. Really it depends on an individual animal's coping capacity. So if you think about yourself, your friends, your colleagues, when you're in a stressful situation, you've probably got friends or family who really don't cope very well. They get very panicky, they get very stressed, they really struggle. And then you'll have other friends or family who perhaps just get on and suck it up and do what needs to be done. And that's because even, within one species, us as humans, we have individual capacities to cope with stressful events. And animals are very much the same. They'll have individual capacities to be able to cope with stress. Some of that will be influenced by their previous learning experiences. Some of it will be influenced by things like early maternal separation and neonatal development experiences. Some of it will be influenced by their evolutionary expectations and their need to perform certain behaviours. It will depend on what type of stress it is, so what exactly the stressor is. Some animals will have a greater capacity to cope with physical stress. Some animals will have a greater capacity to cope with psychological stress, again, depending on the individual. And as to the duration of that stress, again, that's very individual. So it's a really difficult answer to give, a very difficult question to give a very specific answer to. But we tend to define stress in two ways. Stress is either adaptive, so we call this eustress. It's a type of stress that we learn from. We can either learn to avoid that situation again, or if we decide that it's a really exciting stress that we enjoy, like rock climbing or bungee jumping, we may choose to replicate that experience, mostly for humans in those situations. But they're very stressful experiences, but we choose to participate in them. we choose to replicate them. And then we have distress, which is when stress becomes more chronic, more cumulative, and the animal is unable to cope or adapt with that stressful environment or that stressful situation. And because they can't cope, that's when we tend to see physiological expression of stress, such as increased cortisol over long periods of time. And we also tend to see behavioural expressions of stress, such as abnormal repetitive behaviours. So I hope that helps to answer a little bit.
Okay. Well,
I think we're done for time, aren't we?
I think we are done for time, and I think we've gone through, well, certainly all of the questions that I was interested in. If we didn't get around to your questions, we will try and answer them on the thread on the forums. Yeah. And that is the end of the 5 weeks which have a quiz attached to them. So you have until the 5th of April to submit your quizzes. Next week, we are talking about welfare conundrums and emotive welfare issues. So the week doesn't have a quiz attached to it. It's entirely optional. There's no need for you to do this week at all unless you're interested in it. And that will go live on Monday. And Nat and myself, and possibly anyone that wants to join us, will be available for a Google Hangout next week as well. So do remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like, favorite, subscribe, all that stuff if you want our messages to get out to other people. And we will see you next week. So bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.